Bueno, porque no digo nada. Yo no digo nada.
I can say whatever I want. But I told him it's not true. I explained right after. There's this idea that when you are here, what you say is true. So whatever you're saying, it's a statement. I can say minus 1 meter, 0.9, people will believe it. It's just me.
¿Qué es esto? A ver si se colocan 6. Buenas, 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 buenas. Esto no funciona, ¿no? No va. No va. ¿Sí? ¿Hola? Hola. Buenas tardes a todos. De nuevo, muchas gracias por estar allí. ¿Hay algún sitio vacío por aquí, para los que estáis ahí detrás, para que no estéis de pie? Muchas gracias por venir y por responder a la convocatoria. Es la tercera conferencia de esta serie de europeos que se llama Europa Europa. Bueno, me repetiré un poco para los que habéis estado, pero bueno, hace años se hizo una primera serie, Europa Europa 1, en la que se invitaron a jóvenes arquitectos europeos y digamos que repetimos, pero como 10 años más jóvenes, ¿no? O sea, sí, 10 años, ¿no? Más o menos. Más o menos. Bueno, la tercera, yo estoy encantado porque conozco personalmente a Filipe Magalhães, de Fala. Bienvenido, muy obrigado. Y en esta ocasión será Lucia Millet, de Cierto Estudio, quien presentará. Siempre hay alguien que presenta, que no soy yo, y así me quito este cuidado.
Gracias por el marrón. So, good evening, everyone. And thank you very much, of course, Moises, for organizing these amazing lectures. And, of course, welcome to Felipe from Fala Atelier, to this circle of colleagues and friends who have come here to listen to you and to get to know you in person and maybe have a beer afterwards. When Moises asked us to introduce your lecture, I thought, what could be the reason of the link that made him think that Cierto Estudio could be a suitable host for Fala Atelier? And most important, I thought, what does Fala Atelier's work mean to us? And I mean us as representatives of our generation of colleagues and studios. Of course, the obvious and the banal came to me at first. Our studios have been founded in similar dates, Porto, Barcelona, a group of individuals with flat hierarchy, common strong purpose, with name that eludes the use of surnames, like we were talking before, although Fala, no, Filippo, Ana Luisa, Lera, and Ahmed. But the one thing that got to my head was something that took me a couple of days to name. And is that you have somehow removed a certain sense of guilt from our practice. A guilt that weighs on the shoulders of our beloved and equally hated architecture discipline, the trauma. And what do I mean by guilt? Well, I am talking about the education we receive, the extreme weight of construction, gentrification, speculation, responsibility, sustainability, functionality, all the elities that are demanded to our work. Things that sometimes frustrate us and diverts us from our paths, our search of the Holy Grail. Somehow Fala has managed to put aside the guilt, place it on a second plane. Of course, you can take it away, it's in the deal. You have revealed your purpose, taking off the masks of morality, nostalgia, even politics, to shamelessly draw your own line, your language, your collages, your mistakes, your dislocated columns, your beautiful architecture. And that, my friends, I think it's brave and it's meaningful to us. Millennials, especially born in crisis. So when I was developing this idea into my head, I came up with one of your writings titled A Song of Ice and Fire. In that text, you talk about your own fragility, bills, clients, commissions, and how topics such as sustainability, symmetry, composition, or a concept are only addressed by clients if economically advantageous or marketable. And how, besides the endless hours of underpaid work, the non-understood battles, you still claim to find your joy and motivation in your work and your seek for artistic production. The narrative exists, you say. We built to communicate our work, to prove it. So, Filippo, you are very welcome to prove it. Thank you very much.
So, first of all, thank you so much. And thank you for going to pick the worst text we ever wrote, because it's the one where we spilled all our secrets out and made us lose a couple of clients in the process. But a text that is important precisely because of that, because as you said, I don't think we are afraid of saying once in a while what we really think. Not in client meetings, definitely not in meetings with the municipality architects, but in moments like this, it might make sense. Here we go. And thank you, Moises, for, for a long time we had a book in our bookshelf that you just gave us a second copy of. That is the catalog from 10 years ago when the first Europa Europa series happened. And that book is important to us for many reasons, but one of them is that it presents an index of the people, or a lot of the people, or some of the fundamental people that we look up to today. And 10 years later, finding ourselves, in a list with so many friends. First of all, there's a generational vibe indeed, but above all, in the legacy of, Office, ADVT, etc., from a decade ago. It's a big responsibility, and today I have the sole responsibility to present Fala. And Fala is not just me. Fala is a collective. We are 4 partners. There's me, Ana, Ahmed, and Lara. But there's a team. There's Tita, there's Joana, there's João, there's Eduardo, there's Catarina. And all of us together have been for a long time producing what we could call architecture. And we could also call it providing a service. We could also call it a lot of other things, but we like to call it architecture. And when we present ourselves, we often like to do it with this image. That is a photo from Paulo Catrica in front of a column that was cut by the client the day move into the house, where we remove our faces, because in reality, we don't know what Fala is going to be in a few years from now. A couple of those people have left, a couple other have joined, so it's very difficult for us to understand exactly who exactly is Fala at which point in time. But it's important because projects also take a lot of time, so they go through many hands and many discussions. But we like to believe that the office is divided into 2 realities. The first reality, the human one, so this is Fala in the strongest sense of the word. And the other one is the production. And by production, I don't mean the buildings, I mean the fictions, of course. Because I guess no one here has visited any of our buildings yet, except maybe for Moises. And it's fine, it's okay, you don't have to, because that's not really the point for us. We build this, we were discussing just now, to communicate, to narrate, to somehow speak, which makes kind of sense with our name, but mostly to exist. And to us, a building is not more important than a photo of such building or a plan of such building. To us, a magazine, an article, a text, or a drawing are not less than a building. And it's going to be particularly important over the presentation. And another idea that is going to be important is this concept of format. By putting many images of many different projects together at the same time, in the same place, in the same slide, we are saying that each of these images weights the same. We are somehow suggesting that more important than having a main project, and for many years we have been trying to discover what is our main project, what was the project we did so far that is the one that people talk about, and we haven't found it, and I think that's a great victory. So for us, the archipelago of all of these projects is more important than what each of them individually assumes. And everything we do, in a way or another, is houses. I mean, we were taught in school to do museums and schools and skyscrapers, but do we do houses in the suburbs or do we do houses in the city? Small houses, bigger houses, individual houses, collective houses, somehow in funny locations, somehow in relatively anonymous locations. But for nearly a decade, or slightly above a decade, we have been designing spaces for people to live in. And the fact that they are bigger or smaller, suburban or urban, private or collective, doesn't make a big difference. We see them the same. So what I'm trying to say as a start is that, first of all, there's no hierarchy between the projects, and there's no real hierarchy between the programs, so everything is the same. So it's kind of a mishmash. And when we started our practice, we had a sort of sick fascination by a specific generation of Japanese architects. And to frame it between when that generation starts and when somehow that generation starts to fragment and dissipate, there are these two key ideas. The first one, a house is a work of art. And it's a work of art not because we are artsy guys that paint stripes on stuff and that's cool. No, it's a work of art because it has a cultural impact. Because, as I was saying, even if none of you has ever visited any of our projects or many of the projects of the other architects who will speak here today, those projects still can have an impact culturally, socially. But it's also very obvious, like Itsuko Asegawa, 20 years later, after working many years under Shinohara, understood that none of the clients cares about that. That's not what they come up for. They come up for so that we can provide a service. And we end up finding ourselves, between what we want, what we believe, what we stand for, and the sad truth of reality. And in our bookshelves, we have many books, many magazines from such period, from this kind of Japanese vibe, 1962, 1990, more or less, let's say 3 decades of very intense production. And it's very dear to us, it's very familiar, because not only the ideas that they defended up, but the works they produced, but the scene they generated, the whole archive of magazines that they influenced and how they molded the whole country and the whole culture is very dear to us. And a few years ago, maybe inspired by that energy, we produced a book. This book was produced in the University of Toronto, so in an academic context, where we depicted, analyzed, only through the original publication materials, roughly 250 houses from that generation. And we like to redraw. It's a thing we do very often ourselves and with our students. And we try to make sense of that list. And that list has many architects, of course, not just Shinohara, of course, all the other ones that followed. And it made sense to us to do it because we knew this. It's one of two things. Like, you have the information in your head, but you have to draw a plan. You have the references in your mind, but you have to produce a book. So the book, like the houses, like everything I said before, it's just another project. It's just another one of those production icons on that slide. And this created a list, of course. And creating lists is very interesting because, the Europa Europa series is a list. Architecture lectures tend to be a list. And when we finished doing that project, not long after, in a discussion with some friends from Atelier Local, in a few years, they are great contenders to be here, we decided to do exactly the same exercise, but looking from the complete opposite perspective. Instead of going very far to understand the roots of our beliefs, to just look around what's happening around us in Portugal, and to try to make a map out of that. And what we did in this case was a book that is called This Is Not a Portrait, where out of curation, we try to find out what the generation of architects that is struggling with the same battles that we are, very local battles, is producing. And contrary to the first book, there's no drawings, there's no names, there's no captions even, so it's impossible to understand who did what. And that's very important again. A little bit like the philosophy of the office, we believe that this generation that is struggling in a context that is still burdened by seas and Sotodomora, and even worse, by all of those that think that they are seas and Sotodomora. So it's a generation of people that with very little resources and an extreme economy of means is producing a fantastic work. It's not everyone, it's the ones that we believe that are doing a great job. And we felt it was important to do it, but contrary to the first book, that is a book of Japanese houses that is just pulp, there's no reflection, so what you see is what you get and you have to study it yourself. In this one we thought it was interesting to bring guests, but guests from far. Not the ones that are going to try again to make sense from Távora to Cisa to Escola do Porto to whatever we are today, but people that have no idea of what they are looking at and try to make sense of it. And it was very interesting to see how so many people from so many different latitudes were able to see so many different things that to us are obvious, but for a Portuguese criticism would be very difficult to understand. And last but not least, our, let's say, obsessions, they vary, of course, as I said, a specific generation of Japanese architects, a context that we belong to today, but also to this kind of nasty, cheesy 1970s, 1980s architecture that composes the city. the one that we don't talk about, the one that is kind of there, but it's so well designed, the one that is better than Caruso's and John, but it's done by a draftsman from the 70s. And we have been documenting all of these buildings because in a moment where we talk so much about sustainability, heritage, you know, what is the discipline today, buildings like this are not only not protected as they are being destroyed very fast, normally restored, as they say, to make them look like 19th century architecture so that the Airbnb can rent at a higher price. And we believe that that's a pity because we are perfectly fine with those buildings being protected, but we are not fine with the fact that there's very limited amount of constructions from this very rich period in design is not being protected. And as such, I think it helps to frame what I'm going to present after by showing these three pillars of that sustain our narrative. A set of references, not just from Japan, but Japan is a good example, a context and a generation and a series of problems that come with that, and a guilty pleasure of a certain sense of joy in an architecture that is not meant to be joyful as a start. At the same time, we are teachers, and to us, those buildings, those facades I showed before, they are buildings, but they are photos, and they are drawings of sorts, and the drawings that we do with our project, with our students, they are drawings, and they are buildings, and they are ideas of sorts also, and to us, it's very important the way how we draw. We don't teach drawing, we teach studio, but to us, a studio class is a class where we draw, because, you know, I don't remember the last time students built buildings, so that's where the tangible moment happens. And depending on the schools, and we are lucky enough to teach in different latitudes, this takes different forms. And if we are talking about bachelor students, as it's the case here, or if we are talking about diploma students, there's a certain gravitas, there's a certain density that varies with it. And it's very important for us, because teaching puts us to proof, you know, it puts us in a position where you have to answer questions that normally in your office you don't have to, where people ask you why, and you have to have an answer for them because you are teaching after all. And when we mix all of these experiences over the years, some of them on the other side of the Atlantic, some of them in Switzerland, El Dorado, some of them in Central Europe, when you start merging all of this, there's a sort of collective intelligence that operates behind the office, that fuels the office, and that by consequence fuels the teaching itself. And for us, this idea of, let's say, research, teaching, producing books, everything that is not the traditional production of the office, you know, is a little bit between these two ideas. Because in a way, it's not about being against something, it's about being in favor of something else. And it's about understanding that for us, for a long time, although it took us a long time to understand it, we kind of like to be misbehaved. It's necessary, because everyone around us, the client, the promoter, the municipal architect, the guy that does the inspection from the city hall, they are all against this. It's a thing, because you can do stripes, it's legal. But they ask you why, and they force you to not do it, and then the market goes on top of you. So I think this idea of misbehavior is very important for us. And once in a while this happens, so we are asked to present our work, be it in a lecture in Barcelona, be it in an exhibition in Lisbon, or once in a while we are part of collections, and this Europa Europa series is in a way a collection, like the 44 low-resolution houses from Michael Meredith was a few years ago. And it helps us to make sense by understanding what is happening around and why maybe, we believe, we might be also part of such collection. So today I prepared a presentation with two main blocks. One that is sort of kaleidoscopic, that is what I'm going to talk about now. And the second one that is focused on 5 projects that are the most recent projects we did recently, all houses, to sort of illustrate what I'm going to present in the first part. And why gaps in the real? I think that it's important to understand that most of the projects we do, they represent a very, very tiny pixel in a huge image that is Porto, sometimes Lisbon, sometimes the suburbs, in a huge image that is the whole planet. So our let's say, responsibility towards architecture is 0.000000001%. But it's still real, it's still there, it still exists. And from the moment that it's photographed, from the moment that it's shared, from the moment that it's published, it exists forever. So even if the building needs to be demolished, and some of our buildings have, it exists. You cannot kill it anymore. It's an idea. It survives beyond time. And a long time ago, when Moisés invited us to do to G, one of the few things he told us was that we had to write a text. We could not do one of those experimental nexos like some offices do. You have to write a text because you have not written yet. And we thought that was a huge challenge because we had not written yet. And the idea in the title that is simultaneously highly humble and extremely arrogant was this idea of us gloriously repeating our practice over and over and over and over. And it was not very, very obvious for us what this meant yet. It was just an idea. We understand that we are always doing the same thing. And a few years later, when we did A+U, the first text that we wrote, it's called an archipelago, and that's a much more clear understanding of what glorious repeating actually became. And the archipelago is this. The archipelago is living in the Nakajin capsule tower for a year to document it, to photograph it, to understand who else is living there, why, what is it about, to, by living in the thing, understanding the thing from an angle that, you know, a book would never be able to tell us, contradicting everything I just said about our own work, to do an exhibition about such experience, to understand that you cannot take a metabolist icon to Lisbon on a boat. You can only take images, you can only take text. But if you find the right way to build the exhibition, if you find the right way to suspend the content, you somehow can bring some of the ideas of such building and you can transmit the sense of decay that such building was also transmitting beyond its typology. But we come from Japan full of energy and full of motivation, and we find a market that is very different from the one we were taught. We were taught, as I said before, to do museums, skyscrapers, to be the next Caesar, and we are given nasty Airbnb renovations. That's fine. We can do something nice with that. We are asked, because there's no money for more, to convert a garage into a house. No museum yet, no school. And we understood that two things were going to happen. Thing number one, we're going to have to operate with given conditions. By given conditions, I mean a perimeter, a room, an apartment, a house, something that is already there. So it's a sort of collaboration with an architect from 100 years before. We're going to have to be fast, no permits sometimes. 9 of the projects that are in 2G don't have a license, they were built illegally. It's fine, it's okay. The resources are extremely limited. We have a highly skilled craft in Portugal, so the workers are fantastic, but they are all migrating to Switzerland, so we have to be fast at doing fancy stuff because the time is running out. And last but not least, understand that the cover does matter. We have to, you know, whatever we do with the buildings we are designing, they are ours. From the moment we accept that we're going to renovate a building, that we're going to transform, that we're going to demolish a wall, but keep another one, the wall that stays, it's not a problem from the past, it's something that we take as ours. So this starts a completely different wave in the office. So it starts by, first of all, adding buildings slightly bigger, not big buildings, slightly bigger buildings, and making us wonder how to transform them. And in this case, it's a factory on the top left corner that looked like a house, that we were to transform into collective housing that looked like a factory. So this sort of idea of how the archetype, because it's very common that clients tell us, oh, but this house you designed for us does not look like a house. And I love that, because I don't know what a house looks like, but I know it doesn't look like one, so that's probably a first step. Then we're understanding that not only from the suburbs, but towards the city, we would have to deal with the condition of main versus secondary. And this is going to be very important ahead. Main in the sense of the facade. Facing the street, where you have the main facade, the facade that, you know, tourists can photograph, that the public can see, you can do nothing. But facing the courtyards, facing the interior of the city blocks, no one cares. And this understanding that there's a total lack of care in a specific vectorial direction forces us to understand that we don't care about the city per se, we care about the backside of the city. And one of our most important projects at the time was this tiny house. It's a very small renovation of a house that has a very glorious back facade that is just facing a small private garden and a few private neighbors. So 0.00001% of the city of Porto can see it, and I don't know, a few million people can see it in the fiction. So it's a great example for us at the time of how something so irrelevant from an urban perspective, not even, you know, fiscalized by the city hall, could become so important to us. But at the same time, it helped us to understand how to capture a distance, how to look at something from far as a pattern, look at something closely as a composition, and going even closer to understand that it's very flat, but it's full of texture, it's full of different degrees of grain, because the green stone has a pattern, the black one has this sort of explosions, then the ivy grows on top. So it was a very important and almost phenomenological project for us at the time, one of a kind, so we haven't been in this direction since, but very, very important. And it somehow happened at the moment where we are going to our current office. So for a few years, we were working in a shoebox studio, let's say, space, where 10 people were around 20 square meters. So it was very dense. It was very Japanese in a different sense. And in 2016, 17, 18, we moved to this office. I say 3 years because it's a long process. It's a thing that you don't just move one day and that's it. And when we moved to this office, it marked symbolically several things. So it marked, First, the possibility that we're going to have a fixed address. We're going to exist physically, so we're not just going to be an idea that floats in social media and the internet and so on. We exist. And at the same time, it gives us an headquarters to maybe go deeper in the thoughts that we were having before, just floating in the cosmos. It also gave us a building to renovate our own. So our own building, we're going to transform. We're going to have no excuse. There's no permit because it was illegal. There's no budget because we know the money we have. We cannot fool the client. There's a cat, so there's a door for the cat on the door for the... So the conditions were very clearly defined, and it was a very important experimental moment for us to understand that if we don't have the excuse of the problem, what can we do? And since then, it has been the most, let's say, the most important project of the office for a long time, because we live there. So me and Anna live on the top level, Ahmed lives in the middle floor, and we all work in the basement. There's the garden that produces a sort of horizon for all our days. And again, this is a facade that only the person that lives in the apartment where this photo was taken can see. And all of you. And when we started working on this space, I would say that the randomness of the previous projects, where everything was a discovery, everything was new, everything was somehow unplanned. Like now it's a factory that looks like housing, and now it's an apartment, and now it's a back facade. So we were sort of all over the place. But the project starts to repeat, and this is when 2G comes in, and where this idea of the glorious repetition starts to become defined. But it's also the moment where we start understanding that there's a deeper level of the discipline that interests us, much less than the, let's say, romanticism of the, or the pornographic romanticism of the photography of funky building. And that came from looking back at those buildings that we liked so much and starting to take a more theoretical and rhetorical standpoint over them. Starting to understand why, at some point, Shinohara decided to do an axo of a void, why Toyo Ito decided to do a beautiful axo of a beautiful house without the thickness of the construction, of the constructive elements, why at some point he decided to do diagrams with only the morphemes and light points of such house. And why would he write a whole text for general population in 1976 to explain why those forms are the right forms for that specific house? And it was very important to us to understand that all of that interested us much more than anything we were doing with clients and everything we were doing on a commercial level. So what we started to do was to look at the projects we were designing, both the ones that were coming from before, because projects take a long time. Sometimes when you finish the building, you don't like it anymore. It's already like 7 years old. Which, for us, this is a lot. So for some offices, it's not, but for us, it's really a lot of time. And so this is a project that lasts 8 years to be built. And the idea is already there. So it's this idea of the symbolical space from Shinohara, but contrary to Shinohara, it is the main space of the house, the social space. It is somehow the Toyo Ito distorted morpheme space, but it's not exactly that, and it has a column in the center. And this column is not a column, because it's a sort of Takamatsu virtual column, because it doesn't touch the ceiling. And this idea of not touching the ceiling at the time, today to us it's very obvious, but at the time it felt like we discovered dynamite for the first time. It's like the whole manifesto of a whole office is the fact that there's a small amount of space between a column and a ceiling, because this column was architecture, not engineering. It was a sort of liberation technique. This column organizes space, it creates an axis, it creates a center, it defines something, and the fact that it doesn't touch the ceiling is what makes it understandable for someone else that it's not a mistake, it's not something that stays here because it's holding something else. It's something that is there because we want it to be there. And this idea of our will over the necessities of what was, pre-imposed before became more and more evident as something we wanted to fight for in the next project. It's a house that is in a context, and this is our, as I said, I will show a few photos of context. A context that has houses that are all of them very different, but all of them exactly the same. So it's a house that allowed us to never build again on this village because no one likes it. It's a house that is just a house. And in the years that followed, the idea of the column as one of the tropes became central to us. This is a house of 5 levels in the city center of Amarante, so close to the same house I showed before. And to renovate such a house, we understood that pretty much everything that is flexible on the partitions could be removed. It's a house from the 19th century with several additions over the years. But it needed an axis, it needed a center. And what we understood is that what we did with this house was what we were going to do with many houses after. Although we were to work with a book, as I said before, with renovations, with given perimeters, the perimeter was literally just that. Everything on the inside was of no real value, so we could create a new narrative for it. And this column is simultaneously a very formal, a very plastic device. It's a device that says something about its columnness, but it's also just a hinge for a door. It's the two things at the same time. And the whole project becomes not so much what happens around and not the relation between the two things, but the thing that is added. So as if you add an organism, that becomes the project per se. And what is interesting about it is that, of course, you become, you're young, so you do didactic things. You paint the colors in you paint the doors in a color that somehow react with the column, that reacts with the floor and the ceiling. But it's a column that holds the doors. So it's a column that somehow is centrifugous. It's absorbing all of that. And just a few months later, we are doing another project, and we are doing a centripetus column. So the column that sends the doors away. Completely different house, different city, different clients. In this case, actually a construction from start, so a new building. And in this house, the pragmatics of the program defined all the dimensions, and that small imprecision, that means that all the lines in the center, they don't really touch, they almost align. And those disalignments create an opportunity, and that opportunity allows us to add form, because the client here, that is a childhood friend of mine, said he didn't want any of those formalism things you do. I don't want any of that. But he could not see it in plan, and that column is then cut on the bottom so that it does what it has supposed to do since the start. It's not there to hold anything. It's there to sustain a sort of narrative, to sustain a project in a sustainable sense, but from its rhetorical point of view, not from its structural point of view. It failed tremendously because he cut the column on the first day he moved in. So the column does not exist anymore, which I think in a way makes it even more of a strong statement in the idea that the fiction prevails over reality. I could just not tell it, but I don't think it's that important. And this idea of the wireframe, so the drawings we do with our students, the drawing we do for ourselves, the drawing we do to communicate with the clients became, in a way, more important than the column per se, because it helps us to understand how the column is actually the center that makes a very annoying, pragmatic problem of a few disalignments a very powerful statement for a project. And you can see also on the wireframe that shows you plan, section, elevation, everything all at the same time. The mask, the back facade. And the back facade somehow tells you something about domesticity, but tells you something about many other things. So I don't know if this is what a house looks like, but this was the client that told us that the house does not look like a house. And we are very happy about that. And as we move forward, it became easier with time to understand that it was not just about the mask, it was about the construction in a way. So how to do a facade that is not a facade. And a facade that is a facade is this idea that you have a house that looks like this, that has a door, that has a window. And that at some point, it's not so much about even being a window and a stone and a door, it's just about surfaces and materials and lines. So the facade became a drawing, finally. But everything else became a drawing also. So an entrance hall for the bedrooms, the doors of whatever is behind those doors. It's like those TV shows where there's a prize behind one of them, but you don't know which one. This became to us much more valuable than the pragmatics of the program efficiency, arrangement, etc. And of course, some of these projects, because the references started to come still as much from America, 1970s, Japan, 1960s, etc., but also from the world of art, inspired us much and much more to play with the surface, because once more, as I was saying, the budget was still short, the time was still, relatively short also, so we had to be quite impressionistic with simple things like painting a wall, painting a circle, painting a curve. We also started to develop projects where the whole idea of the house is about how the plan is actually composed and how such a plan is a sort of organism where a series of secondary programs are attached to a main program that becomes what you could call the social aspect, the social side of the house, but it's at the same time circulation. And it looks like a duck on the outside. And it somehow gave us the opportunity once more to question what is a house and to question to what extent what we are doing are really houses. Because if no one is to live there and we are to install a bank, could it still work? We were also once more trying to understand how to deal with context and how to operate in denial, because we made such a big effort to do a house that does not look like every single house in the context at which we operate, that we are truly sure that in a few years from now, this house is just going to be another one of them there in the middle. We actually heard recently that there's a possibility that roof tiles are going to be added to it, which I find it's fantastic. And I mean, I'm serious. It's really fantastic if it happens. And it's a house that deals with a certain legacy of the modern movement. So it's a modern house. It's a house that deals with transparency, with a certain absoluteness. And it's Corbusier-esque in the sense that it has the plan libre, it releases the columns from the perimeter, but at the same time a surrealist house because the columns are somehow the first inhabitants of such space. they occupy, they obstruct daily life, they are there. They don't allow you to put the table where you want to. It's like living with someone you don't like that much. And then when you go on the top level, you understand that the house has a sort of metamorphosis and becomes a drawing. You know, this to me is less, it's not less of a wireframe than the wireframes I showed before, because all those lines that you see in plan, section, elevation, they come together. And the hints of color and hue, even if this is a very traditional Portuguese palette, you have concrete ceiling, so to the more you have white wall, Caesar, but a few touches are enough to make it become something else, we hope. Which is different from the first houses we did. This was probably the first house we finished, the renovation. And it's what we could consider a first project, you know, when the ideas have to be super linear, extremely blunt, extremely clear. If the context is granite, the house is metal. If the contract is rough, everything is flat. If the space is white, the doors are blue. It's like a second-year student doing a project, but it came out quite well. And a few years later, we were to renovate an ilha. An ilha is a 19th century workers' row housing typology, very typical from Porto, inside the city blocks, where everyone over the years paints their own house in a different color, creating an even smaller sense of scale, because everything becomes very individual, and trying to understand that for the first time we had the opportunity to design a public space. And the public space was not a big plaza again, it was not a big lobby for a museum, it was just the backyard of the backyard of the backyard of a city block that, by having a few plants, allows a typology that is very negatively connotated to become a bit more fresh, a bit more happy. And again, the question of the perimeter. So these granite walls are to be kept, this sequence of rectangles, and inside a few lines in tension, diagonals, arches, stepped walls. They will go back to that Toyoito morphine drawing, and they try to deconstruct what would be otherwise a relatively blasé interior space, which is a complete opposite of a similar house that we are doing at the same time, a flower depot that has been abandoned for 20, 25 years, a ground floor flower depot. Very long, very difficult to manage because it's just 5 meters in width, but almost 35 in length. So it's very, very, very long, but very tall at the same time. And that reminds us of this infinite space that Toyoito is doing in that house for his sister and for the 2 daughters, and how maybe that's not a problem. Maybe if we are able to understand that this house is not composed out of bedrooms and living rooms and kitchens, it's just composed out of a big main space. That space is not seen as a living room that failed, but as a plaza that managed to enter into a house, as a sort of hortus conclusus, as a sort of, let's say, possibility of a public space in a private domain. And as this kept going in projects that followed, so this is almost 4 years after, it's Ahmed's apartment, maybe that idea of the oasis and the hortus conclusus, it's just that the space that is at the end of the house, that is normally the garden, becomes just the last room. But the fact that it does not have a ceiling or a roof in this case doesn't mean that it's not still another room of the house in continuation. And the interior of the house is just very plastic and expressionistic desire of one's dreams and ambitions. This is like, I like to say that if you enter Ahmed's brain, this is what you see. It's this kind of lights and patterns and diagonals all over the place, and the Maribota lamp, of course. And when you go out, you understand that these gaps in the real are, this is a perfect example for the title, are just tiny, tiny fractions of the city that in the end have, 7 or 8 levels of normality on top and 7 or 8 levels of normality on each side. And they are even not trying to be too much. It's just a kind of Ellsworth Kelly reference to this big black rectangle, and that's it. But inside, it goes back to a certain sense of festivity. So this is not about the public space, this is about celebration. And on the other side of the city block, so this is a time where we are building in Porto all over the place. So most of these projects are 100 meters away from each other. There's this possibility of doing exactly the opposite. It's the same problem. So the ground floor typology that has been a shop for tools for many years, but has been abandoned, that has in this case 2 levels, that has again this huge helmet of normality all around. And you see the back facades, they tend to be relatively dull, because contrary to us that celebrate the fact that the back facade doesn't matter and try to do the most out of it, this is a back facade, for example. Everyone else thinks back facades, they don't matter, therefore you should just ignore them. And I find that tension pretty much illustrative of our condition in Porto. But in this case, what mattered to us was the possibility of bringing reflection as a material. So the glass, the mirror, makes the face of the house reflect the trees that are on the complete opposite side of the garden, allowing the house to become more and the facade to become more than just black dots, red lines, and pink triangles. So it's all of that true, but it's also the context. And in the evening it flips, because suddenly the actors of the house, so the people who inhabit it, the people that move around, they somehow project themselves in the shadows of the facade. So it's a house that has a certain phenomenological vibe to it. But it's a house that is a drawing in the clearest sense of the word, a drawing in this case that draws from inspiration from Itsuko Asegawa's wireframes from '84, that tries very hard to be a system that makes sense as a whole, even if in the end it's built with, very mineral materials. It has brick, it has plaster, it has cinder blocks, it has paint, but it's a very transparent, or at least translucent, possibility. Everything reflects, everything deconstructs itself, even if in the end it's built by the same people with the same technology of all the houses that surround it. And it's a house that is inhabited. In this case, there's no annoying column in the center of the space, but there's a kitchen that becomes a sort of Luis Borges animal that is already occupying the space before the inhabitants do, and where the idea of how the light comes in the back facade is already somehow an action that impacts the house as a whole. It has a lipstick moment where the staircase that goes up has to be hidden because no one wants to see the back of the staircase of the building above. And it can be hidden by hiding in plain sight and being painted in red and becoming a very important piece of the living space. And as you go down, every single element, every single opportunity to solve a problem becomes an opportunity to do something meaningful, be it a handrail, be it the forehead of the slab, be it the staircase that goes up. Which is different, but at the same time relatable to this possibility of transforming an endless territory to a house. So in this case, a garage, a cloth factory that was a garage for many, many years, that has more than 100 years of age, that has this very heavy, but at the same time very light wood structure, that by being covered in cloth, in textile, somehow questions the lightness of such wood. So there's something even lighter above it. And it's a house that is a territory, as I said, because the social spaces, the main spaces, let's say the public space of the house is almost 500 square meters, so infinite. And as a house, to make sense as an idea, all the private programs are stressed in the two ends, and they are compressed to be smaller than they have to be. There's enough area to divide with the two, but we thought that as an idea for the house, as a sort of, again, main versus secondary, so drawing again from inspiration from Shinohara main spaces, there's this possibility that everything has to be too small for the big space to be even bigger. And the drawing of the plan becomes in itself a very vivid representation of that contrast. The main space is just that, every other space is something else. And the ideas are very obvious, of course, the references, the infinite city from, the no-stop city from Archizoom and the tent from Cicle. And from the outside is a house that, again, is a gap in the city. It's a gap in the real. It's this idea that only if you are a seagull and you fly high enough, you will see that there's something going on there, because otherwise it's protected from the world. We like to say that a roof, if it's well designed, it protects the house from the sky. We like to believe, in our case, the roof protects the sky from the houses most of the time. So that's very, very important to us. And that's the biggest house we ever designed, and it's very improbable that we might be able to design a bigger house in the future. But just a few meters away, there's the smallest house we ever designed. In this case, it's a house for my brother that you can see a lot from this photo. You can understand the original house form of, the row houses facing the street. The house is 3.5 meters wide by about 10 meters in depth, so it's very, very small. And what we thought that was interesting is that the same way that everyone celebrated their houses by building a sort of nasty metal annex in the back, if we were to rebuild this house, we probably should do it in this sort of more, let's say, negligent manner with the metal structure, and at the same time respect the alignment of the given, but propose a more honest extension on the back. The back facade is in itself also an aggregation. It's a group of things that just come together and try to make sense of a facade. Yes, it's a window, yes, it's a column, yes, it's a beam, yes, it's a roof, yes, it's a shutter, but it's a yellow rectangle and a blue line and two black rectangles on the side. So to us, it's difficult to understand what is one thing and what is the other. In section, it's a house that obeys to a certain extent to the context because it follows the blue alignment, right? But on the inside, it's also a house that tries very hard to not just be that. So to tries to liberate itself from the dogmatism that the maximum volume is the maximum volume. It's also a house that is built with very low budget. So the house was built with almost no money. Therefore, the possibility of a second level, of a mezzanine, of that luxury is not in place. So what remains is a void. It's a sort of luxury of entering a space that is so, so tiny, but looking up and still feeling like it's generous. It's kind enough. And it's a sort of a manifesto for a moment that we live today where, I don't know, it is in Barcelona, but in Portugal, the prices are skyrocketing. Properties, construction, it's insane. I don't know how long we are going to be able to build. It's really, really getting to that point. So the possibility that with nothing, so by just allowing a void to exist, we do something became an important statement for us, and that's why we decided to use that photo as the cover of our latest monography. The possibility that in 5 years from now, if we were to do the same, we would do a completely different image, because I guess we are going to be having different questions and different inner fights. But today, this is the inner fight, how to be able to continue building, because we want to build. We don't care about building, because we only care about the fiction. But if we don't build, we don't generate fiction, so we need to. And this is a beautiful fiction to us. And the way how we draw plans became a game on its own. So be it the fact that there's rules and exceptions and somehow Kelly-esque shapes, how to deal again with the perimeter. So the perimeter that was a ruin that we have to operate within its boundaries became a very abstract square from Kelly that is defined not by the square lines but by the diagonals that touch. But it's also about somehow the harshness of putting a very annoying column in the center of a very small lobby, making it, we call it an aggressive element, and in this case, this is actually a structural one, so if you cut this one, the house falls, but still giving it a very tiny and cute wood skirting. So being aggressive enough, but kind enough at the same time. It's about form, and it's about form in the purest sense of the word. So it's about form as volume, it's about form as shape, it's about form as color, it's about form as impact. So I don't know what came first, the egg of the chick or the chicken, if it was the step or the curve, if it was the stair or the green rectangle, if it was the door or that kind of warm toned surface. So all of these things to us become quite virtual in the sense because we know that we are building for the fiction, therefore the building is not the final stage, but a sort of in-between condition like a model to be photographed and discarded. And the building as a scan also becomes that, because you understand all the exceptions and how all of this intervention, all of these operations impact the space, but it's also interesting to go back and to look at all of them together as a project per se, as if all of these blue surfaces are a project that are hidden inside a bigger project. And how sometimes something as simple as 1,000 euros of stone allow a building that is meant to be a poor, sad little building to have a pyjama pattern and somehow to become a bit more noble. And this is a soft building. It's one of those that if you knock, it's shallow, it's just plastic, but it has those lines of stone that kind of make it feel noble. And another thing that is important to say, and I'm really finishing this first part, is that many times we are discussing public space, how to deal with a public space, how to deal with a city. This is our city. This is a project we are building now where the city space we have to design is the gate. So we have to design a gate because the volume is defined, the alignments are defined, so there's a front, there's a back. So everything you have to deal with is with the idea that you're going to communicate through a surface, because even that is defined a priori, because we don't like balconies, with the city. So it's very flat. And that kind of comes to us as maybe a justification way too late why we do so many collages, because most of the times that's it. The impact we have to create from an urban perspective is a flat construction of rectangles, squares, colors. We are very, very much interested in the new phase we are entering with collective housing. Collective housing, small blocks with 3 apartments, for example, and trying to understand how to compose less in a, let's call it Japanese sense, the form of the space, and more in a Swiss sense, the transversality of the space. How to understand the repetition as a new possibility for diversification. And at the same time, understanding that some projects, they have, very different plans, so they can allow for something to happen. Other projects, they have repetitive plans. So trying to understand even clearer to becoming clearer to us, what is it about the repetition that fascinates us? And maybe it's just about the relation between a point of view and a window to the exterior. And as we develop these projects further, we start to understand that maybe it's not a question of either or, so it's not about the symbolic aspect of Japan or the very pragmatic understanding of program from Switzerland, or the very opaque Japanese houses very closed on themselves, or the very open Swiss houses. It's just a matter of understanding that the two things can coexist, and maybe that's what is inspiring us for the next few years of projects we are designing now, how to bring these two universes that seem opposite in a sense to come together. And last but not least, celebrate, instigate the possibility that we will talk about this facade for years to come. It's now being built, and we are going to present it, we are going to narrate it, and no one cares. It's just a house, or in this case, a housing block. It's going to be the background of the city life. So it's going to be a house that is going to exist for 1 million people every day, or a house or collective housing. But it's just going to be the background noise, the funny, probably criticizable background noise of the city. But to us, it's going to be a very important statement, precisely because of that. That condition that we learn to understand with time, because speculation also creates that what they don't care about the back facade is also now applied to the front facade, because they just want Excel sheets and gentrification. By they, I mean the market, of course. And this is the real title of the lecture, and good housing is not a classification. So good housing is not how we see what we do. Good housing is an umbrella. It's a sort of objective. It's like the carrot that you put in front of the donkey so that the donkey keeps moving. It's a sort of energy that we are looking for. And this is a title that we gave to the teaching semesters we are doing now in the different schools where we teach, because we believe that after a decade trying different things everywhere, it was the time to start narrowing down and focusing on a single theme. And why good housing? First of all, because, as I said before, everything we do is houses. I mean, we did a couple of tiny, like a shop here or an office there, but it's a grain of sand in a sea of houses. And why good? Because, if you're going to do something, you should try to make it good, whatever that means. And it can mean many different things for many different people. And good housing to us, it's a lot about the tension of these two images, about, let's say, the staging of daily life. Because when we design a house, we are actually trying to project, to anticipate how a specific building is going to be inhabited. But it's also about the virtual reality of the city, the project, the drawing, the fiction I was talking about before. So both of these are about falseness in a way, about fictionality. It's not about reality, because the only thing we cannot control in a house is how it's going to be lived. So we cannot be there every day to correct the position of the husband, to explain the wife why to go this way, to tell the kids why not to run on the corridor. So that's not our role. So everything we can do is to fictionalize and assume it's going to work out. And the reality is that we have been transitioning between two scales. So for a long time, there was a very tiny, as I said, the gap in the city, this tiny pixel of a percentage of a building that was somehow disconnected from everything else. Suddenly it became obvious that the crisis is over. So the economical crisis from the 2010-11 in Portugal is clearly over. And people move back to new construction. And this is a big building to us on the left. It's 500 square meters. So for our scale, that's big. That's a big construction. And at the same time, in the last few months, in the last couple of years, we won a series of competitions of public housing with friends from Porto, Experimental and Pomo, with landscape architects. And now there's a scale that each of these buildings, that is one of the biggest we are doing, fits 50 to 60 times in each of the buildings on the right. So it's a jump of scale that makes this idea of the fictionality also find itself in a position to be re-questioned. And what kind of fiction are we going to produce in the next few years? So I will present very briefly 5 houses that talk about 5 typologies. A normal house, a renovated house, a fragmented house, collective housing, and the city. So this is always the normal house. The normal house is a house in Lisbon. It's a house in a plot that is very sloped, so that goes up almost 5 levels from the top until the bottom. And because the house is at the bottom part of that slope, it's almost sunken on one side, so it has a very proud facade facing the city, but on the back there are all of these levels of the garden that had to be controlled in a way with platforms that allow you to see the planes landing in the airport nearby. It's a house that has a back facade that looks exactly like the front facade. It's built from scratch, so it's not a renovation, it's a new building. So it's a building that happens already at the moment where for us this idea of front and back, it's intention. So we cannot, even if we don't care about the city, we want the city to care about us. We want to annoy the city enough that we have to make the statement pass. It's a house that, as you can compare with the neighbors on both sides, seems to be 7 levels high, although they are just 3 levels high. And when you start looking closer, you understand that it's maybe not that big. It just has very, very tiny windows. It has a pattern of stones that somehow suggests patterns on patterns on patterns. And it's very difficult to understand because you see 2 doors down, it's a building that is 7 levels high. So when one looks at a house like this, one has to wonder what is going on the inside, because everything you have is, again, sort of virtual construction of a facade through the proportions and positioning of the windows. So maybe it's like, being John Malkovich. So all the floors inside are just 1 meter high. So of course not. It's not what is happening. It's a split level system. And this split level system allowed us, it comes from very pragmatic reasons, how to put a few more square meters of program here and there, because it's a very tiny house in a relatively expensive area of Lisbon. At the same time, it allowed us to do something that is not very common, to be in the room and you can either look at the sky or look at the floor, so you can never look horizontally outside. And it allowed us to solve also the fact that the street itself has a slope that complicated a lot the access to the house. It's a house where, from the first moment, we discussed with the client that we were going to follow this path, and he was very excited about it. It's one of the best clients we ever had, I have to admit. The detailing of the construction had to be on the table right away, because every single line of the house is like a parametric object. If the tiles, instead of 10, they would be 11 centimeters, the whole house moves. The whole house goes and follows. And it's a house that in plan it's very simple. So as a split level system works, it's cut in the center with a staircase. And as you keep going, in every split level, you enter a room. All the rooms are more or less the same size. They are free to be used as the client wants. So there's one that uses as an office. There's one that is empty. There are 2 that are used as bedrooms. There's the kitchen on the top. And the final space, it's what he calls the music space because of, well, you will see. And you see, the plan is again so every single part of the plan is about parametricism in a certain sense. So all the lines, they have to match, they have to touch. And inside the perimeter, because contrary to most of the houses were renovated, in this case there was no perimeter built, but there was a perimeter imposed because of the urban regulations of Lisbon. You have to follow very specific footprint. So this is what was added inside a rectangle, so a few lines. So let's say that has a plan, it's not rebellious. And when one looks at the wireframe from the plan on the left or the wireframe from the section, we could even say that there seems to be some sort of relation between the two. And what the house is really trying to do is to deal with the tension that the perimeter of the house and the lines that were added inside, a little bit like in a Robert Mangel painting, they try to do. And it's also a house that is based on many of those references that I was talking about before, but not necessarily the Shinohara school. So there's Watanabe, there's Ando, there's Isosaki. So it's learning from that book. So it happens at the moment where we are doing this book. So it happens at the moment where all of these names, besides knowing them, they are fresh, they are there, they are being scanned on the table. And we try to go for the obscure ones. So the ones that are less obvious, well, except the Ando house in the middle, all the other ones. And it's a house that, you could look at all the collages of all the rooms and understand that there are anchor points that hold them together, and there are a few things that change, but overall this photo that is of one of the rooms could be of any room, because the walls that do the perpendiculars to the perimeter are all glass brick. Which means that it's a house that is somehow erotic. Erotic in the sense that whoever goes up the stairs, whoever turns on the light, if you turn on the TV, you participate in a sort of choreographed fiction of the life of the house. So every time that someone goes up, every time that someone wears a red shirt, that person is activating the house per se. The staircase is, it's a relatively brutalist house in the sense that most of the materials are left raw, and it's a material palette that is simultaneously very poor and very rich, because it has a bit of mahogany, it has, stone tiles on the floor, but at the same time it's relatively blunt with white doors and white walls. It's a house that finishes in a vault, so until that frieze that you see in the top, the house is ruled, so it's just the same sequence of rooms that keep piling up. And in the end, after that frieze, it's just exceptions, including the kitchen hood that floats from the vault down. And then you can see it's a house that on the last floor, so if in the first level I only have windows on the top, and as I go up I always have windows on 2 levels, on the last one I only have windows on the floor, on the music space, which means that when you sit here listening to music, you can only look down at the roofs of your neighbors. And it's a house that when it's sunny you have the shade, and when it's not sunny you still have the shade of the sun, in a sort of surrealist idea that it's always summer in Lisbon. And this is what the music space sees in the end. And it was not meant to be a music space, but miraculously, by a huge coincidence, when the house was finished, we understood that there's a fantastic acoustic on the last level, due to the arch, the shape of the material, but also the proportion it has. And the client is an aficionado of classical music, so it's funny to see it in that level, which we never could predict. So many houses we design, they have columns that are cut. Sometimes you have a house that is actually surprisingly used. And this is another wireframe, and the facade. And the facade is a series of symbols. So as you go around the city, as you pass on the street, you have this sort of deconstructive moment where the system is so perfect, so mathematically perfect, that the difference, because there's a small gap, because you have certain measures, doesn't work, so you just clad those 2 sides in mirror, and somehow you make the system perfect, just in the buffer zone that stays between the two mirrors. And what is funny also at night is like a magician house. So if you are in the garden and you turn on the lights, there's a moment where you see a foot and you see a head. And then you see a foot and you see a head. And it's funny because it's like the magician that cuts the assistant. So you assume that the parts of the body are just misbehaving once more. The second house, it's one of the most recent projects we finished. It's in Porto. It's also one of the strongest manifestos on economy of means that we had to play with in the last few years. It's very, very cheap. It's very, very superficial. Superficial in the sense that it's about the surfaces and about the correction of a specific problem. So it's a house in Rua da Alegria, so city center of Porto, very, very well located. It's the house of a very important architect from Porto, actually the atelier of a very important architect from Porto, Alberto Dias, that worked there for many, many decades, but that used it as he found it. So it was an objet trouvé. He just found it, he used it, and he never really did anything significant with it. And after many, many years, so both the years before his occupation and after the years with his occupation, the house is in a terrible condition, and the main problem it had is that the structure of the wood slabs was starting to crumble. Let's say the wood beams, they were starting to bend too much. And we understood that considering the budget, considering the calendar, considering all the circumstances of the project, it had to be a project about points, about surfaces, about things that are added very, very quickly, and again without a permit. And in this case, it's a project that facing the street has a stone that corrects a very specific problem that was on that part of the wall, but celebrates it. We didn't have tiles that look like those. It has a hat, and the hat solves all the problems on the roof and the gutter and all of that, but the most important, gives identity and gravity to the smallest of the four brothers. And then it has yellow window frames, which is completely forbidden according to Portuguese regulation, if you ask for a permit. And so the whole house operates on a very fast pace, so project, construction, everything is just a race, because the client wants to rent it as soon as possible, of course. And this is the plan as we found it. You see, it's a plan that has rooms, so it has the normal occupation of a building like this over the years. And our project is I think it's the first time we ever show reds and yellows drawings. You know the convention, right? Yellow is what is removed, red is what is added, where just a few lines, just a few things were proposed, but most important, there are those points. There's that line in the middle that is the structural reinforcement that became the only unnegotiable condition to make the building work as such. So the whole project is about 4 points that go all the way up, 1 point that goes up isolated, and a few lines that are new walls. So it's very, very limited in amount of things that were added. Almost nothing is demolished, so perfect for the time we live in, right? Sustainable. And it's a project that is in this tension. In a way, those columns that are very fragile, and you will see the images, the columns look more like the ones from the right, but they behave more like the column of the left. Very powerful, muscular, tense column that seems to misbehave, because if you consider how that roof operates in Shinohara's house, that beam makes no sense. From a structural point of view, it's a beam that is wrong, but it's undeniable that it has a gravitas, that it pushes you. And the sensibility that we have in the Flemish project is somehow more relatable to the one we're going to have in the construction, but not necessarily the same mental construction to hold it. And this idea of Duchamp and the photo and 5 photos is interesting, because when we work with surface, you are left with maybe color, paint, mirrors sometimes, and the whole house became a game of smoke and mirrors. So there's a few surfaces that are cladded. There's a system. Perpendicular walls are dark green, parallel walls are white, the columns are blue, the beams are red, the ceiling is very misty green. The floor is wood. And with all of these rules, plus the elements that were added, the house operates. And so from that point onwards, you have several moments where you see how everything is somehow the same, because it's just paint in the most part. But at the same time, if you were to remove the structural elements, not only you would have a structural problem, as you were to remove somehow the soul of the house. And it's a house that is very different during the day and during the night, because with artificial light, it gets a game of, artificial light plus the mirrors plus the shadows makes the house very different from the house during the day. It's very vertical, because the open space in the staircase remain the same. And it has moments like this where it's kind of difficult to really understand how to navigate. All the old elements were kept, even the plastic handrail that the previous architect left. So it's kind of celebrating many things at the same time. And it's a house that, like the works of Art Schwager, everything is a bit out of proportion, a bit odd, but kind of nicely oriented. But it's also a mental construction, because this is what was added to the house: columns, beams, a new roof, of course, and a few windows. But the house lives in the tension between what was kept and what was there. So that's an example of what I was saying before, that we cannot present it as an excuse that because it's renovations, there are things we could not control whatsoever. No, we have to grab it as a whole, and what we keep needs to be kept in a way that also becomes part of our project, not of someone else's project. And there are many moments where there's a need for a step because the heights did not match. There's a diagonal on the beam. There's this moment. So there are a lot of intrusive columns, and all of these are actually structurally necessary. And there's the moment where the mirror can take the whole surface or can become just a diagonal. There's an inner room that might celebrate light by having glass brick to it. There's all of these old windows that represented, I don't know, different uses over the years, and there's columns and doors and, you know, the tension between the two. There's this problem on the system where if all the walls on this direction are green and all of these are white, what do you do when you have a curve? It was a very interesting discussion on site, because it was the only point where the rule did not apply. There's this tension on one side of the wall where you don't know what is behind those two doors, and then when you go around, you understand again it's a structural device. And so the house is made of these episodes. So if we were to photograph it, if it was possible to photograph the structure always from the same position, you would have always the same two columns and the same beam operating the same way but in different rooms. So this sort of festive coexistence, and then those funny things from the Porto scene, where from the Porto traditional architecture, where the window is slightly recessed, are celebrated also with a mirror, which is just a continuity below, and the old shutters are kept in tension with very cheap yellow metal new windows. And yeah, these are more episodes of that. And for example, because of the wood that was added between, so each door, so it's an architecture of rooms, so you have rooms after rooms. There's a line of mahogany that is the luxury we were able to allow ourselves, that separates one room from the other all the time. And yes, and it's a house that tries very hard to ignore the fact that it was built with roughly 60,000 euros, which, considering that it's 400 square meters of house, it's very, very little. So even for Portuguese standards, it's very, very small, the budget. And on the back, there's a thermal question, in the sense that this house is facing almost south on the back facade. It had no insulation, no climatization, so it had to be all passive. So we tried for the first time to dive into a very dangerous road that we don't understand completely, which is passive climatization, and to try to create a winter garden that, according to our engineers, is going to make the house livable on the hot summer months. And that summer garden, that winter garden, also becomes a sort of festive device. The facade on the left is cladded in mirror and makes it twice its size, and the floor is cladded in tiles with the same pattern of the handrail facing the back. And when the sun comes in, so when it's actually necessary, such a space, the reflection of the shadow and the reflection of the shade and the reflection of the, even of the exterior that we're going to see after, they play their role. And again, the winter garden at night with flash, it's very different from during the day with sun. And there's this photo on the left is one of my favorites, because what we are seeing is the back facade of the original building, and that window is an original window that was kept, cladded in mirror, reflecting the window that is behind the photographer and reflecting the garden behind it. So it's somehow learning from that other house with a metal facade that I showed before. And on the right, you see the explanation of that photo to make sense of it. Giulietta did many beautiful photos. She was living in the house for about 2 weeks and photographing it randomly, you know, in her own personal style. And it was very nice to come out with this sort of duos where you need a photo to explain the other photo, even for us that sometimes did not understand what she was showing us. The back facade is also, well, we wanted to do the whole back facade in stone, but it's half mirror because, you know, cost reasons. But in the end, I think it's actually better like this, because it deconstructs the stone, because the stone that is white actually becomes sort of dark gray, and the mirror that theoretically it's black becomes very white during the day, but inverts completely during the night. And this is the back facade of the garden, facing the garden, and yeah, that's that. These ones are shorter. So this is a project in Sobral de Montegras. So this is a fragmented house. It's a house that is not a house actually. So it's a community, let's say a digital nomad community that moved half an hour away from Lisbon to this very remote location called Sobral de Montegraço, where they acquired a slice of a mountain, and in such a mountain they were to build the infrastructure for, let's say, for the owners to live, for the inhabitants of, let's say, the community to live, and then a collective space where they would have their activities, their performances, the dancing classes, etc. And it's a project that since the start was composed out of 3 pieces in a very vast land, so it was, this artwork from Baldassari came to mind, how to align how to randomly keep trying to find a way that 3 points actually align. Not aligning in the geometrical sense, but in a mental sense. It was very good the way how they structured the program. So they had a very clear understanding of what they wanted on each building. And that gave us very easily in the start the idea that there's a small, a medium, and a large building, at least based on the numbers. And I'm going to jump a huge leap to not explain the half circles because it was a very complicated process. But when we reached these proportions, we understood that each of these buildings had a specific use: the private house, the collective house, and the shared space. Each of them had to have a certain percentage of open space and a certain percentage of, let's say, private spaces that are romantic and small and private, let's say. And we try to find an idea for those, including the usual cliche of the void and the Gothic space. But we understood that our Gothic architecture happened somewhere in the 70s, our Falas, I mean. And we took from there the inspiration to find the right way so that this would be really about a collage, but not a collage anymore of surfaces, but a collage of spaces, let's say. On the right side, nothing. On the left side, something. And the something are 3 houses from 1976, from 3 formalists, Ito, Gary, and Cisa, that are rotated, distorted, scaled, but that give us above all what we needed. The rooms, and I can assure you there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of houses tested and rotations, and because in reality form doesn't matter, but it's all about form. It's all about the right form in the right place, and about them being all from 1976 and from 3 different continents. And the proportion shows you that there's a certain rhythm, and if there was a 4th building, it would have 3 columns. It would have 7, 9, 11, 13 modules, so it would have to obey to the same rules. So it's again like in the previous house, we created a parametric game, and now we have to accept the results of it. And they are very fine with this. It's fantastic how clients allow us to do these things. And these are the 3 final plans. And again, how when you overlap the 3 of them, you understand the sort of Fibonacci sequence that the plans have to present. But what these spaces are trying to do is not very different from the Tanikawa house. The Tanikawa house has a technical side on the left, and it has this huge, beautiful symbolic space that Shuntaro Tanikawa called the summer space. And what we tried to do with this house was to also deal with the ground, with the earth, like Tanikawa house does, but not necessarily by sloping it, not necessarily by making the earth come in, but by making the earth come on top of the house itself and making the building disappear. So imagine a building that, like in a novelesque way, is represented for the season. So the seasons will be the facade of the building, which brings us back to that phenomenological aspect of the reflection of the tree on the other side of the garden. So it's, I don't know, it's a phase. And this is how the buildings will look like. They will be just very thin slits of glass, very modern in an endless green territory. And as you go down, they start getting smaller, and you have this white these white negatives on the pictures, on the collages, that are the stones that resulted from the digging that are just spread all over the territory. So this is the site, this is the placement, which was also, fun enough, the clients accepted completely the project very easily. It was actually a very interesting discussion because it was not a discussion, it was a conversation. And then we spent months discussing where each half circle has to go. This was very, very, very important. And in the end, we got 2 right. So the 2 on the right, the 1 on the left, they are not happy. So that's where we failed. And this is the photo of the construction, where to make the ground be exactly the same in the end, we actually had to move all the ground away and then bring it back. So it's not sustainable at all. And you see how the earth is moved around and then it has to be brought. But it's a beautiful photo to see during this moment where that collage and the construction sort of come together and make sense together. And you can see also it's a very honest construction. The line that defines the perimeter and defines the separation between Baroque and empty is actually the structural line that holds the building. And you see it here, they are casting or preparing the cast of the curve, and you already see the diagonal of the biggest room with the 2 columns. So what you see on the plan as a drawing today to us is more important than before. Before we would do poché, before we would do certain things that today feel a bit wrong to us, we like the idea that the honesty of the drawing is the honesty of the construction. And this is the space. So it's finished for a few months now. And it has this is the collective shared space for activities that, besides being bigger or smaller, could be the same and of the three of them. So one has a diagonal on one side, the other one is perpendicular, the other one does the third direction. And this image has been an obsession of ours for many, many years. And why did Shuntaro Tanikawa and Koji Taki and Shinohara built a replica of the Cézanne ladder? Why did they do it? And how would they use this space actively? Not as a poetic thing that we talk about, but how can you actually use this space? And we tried very hard to find a, let's call it, pragmatic version of it, and we landed on this. And we felt like we don't know why they did the Cézanne ladder, but we know why we did the Tanikawa ladder. So our replica is not a replica of Cézanne on this ladder, is a replica of the Tanikawa ladder. And it's funny how the house or the houses or these volumes are so closed facing one side, but then on the opposite side they are completely open, and they have these funny Botte-esque columns that kind of give you a different gravity towards the outside. When you go to the Baroque spaces, you have here the corridor of the Caesar house on the top level of the bedrooms, but it's higher, but it's wider, but it's in the wrong colors. When you go, we have on the left side the kitchen from the Gehry house, on the right side the entrance hall from the Toyoito house. And this is the corridor of the kitchen from the Frank Gehry house. And all of this to us, it's very obvious, or not so obvious, but relatable. But it's not obvious in any other way other than a fictionality that can be narrated. So it's a good project as an example of what I was saying about before. It's a project that was designed so that it can be explained as a fiction in a context like tonight. And as you go out of this, so we go back to the territory. So we were inside these buildings and we go away. We have the shading device. Everyone is putting flaps on buildings these days. We felt we should take part in that. And there's the construction, because it's actually very simple construction with asphaltic screen, and there's a mirror on the corner to deconstruct the thickness and to somehow make the thickness of the wall dilute with the reflection of the glass. And just on the corner, on the less obvious space, there's a bit of stone, green stone, that gives an idea of a certain noble construction that is actually sunken. So it has a very romantic energy. And as you start moving away, the rocks that I was talking about will start to appear. And as you move away, you understand there are a few technical boxes on the campus, be them for the heat pumps, the AC machines, the well, that are just painted in very strong colors, assuming themselves as part of an artificial nature. Well, in reality, all of these stones are artificially placed today. And as you go down the slope, you start to see the tiny village that is right next door. This is the last village. So after this is the project, and then there's just cultivation land for a long time, and you start having these funny perspectives where the position of the building that failed was calculated so that it would become a bump that would protect the front of such building from the village. But today the village is almost empty, so the bump is actually sort of unnecessary. And as you go on top of the buildings, you see this very strong, let's say, metallic lines that contradict the sort of random nature of the floor and the position of the stones. And as you really go up, you have just this perception where only the technical boxes kind of show up. You see a corner of one, and now we are working with them to transform the chicken factory that is on the other side, so this guy, into a dance hall, which is sort of funny. And it's interesting because it's a building of the same nature of one I showed before in the introduction, with this huge living space, and again with a very small budget, so a very interesting exercise today to understand how to do a lot with very little. 85, it's a very fast one because it's an old project. It's a project from 2016 that has been on the freezer for a long time because of speculation. The client didn't want to do it and thought it was too expensive, then COVID, then war, then he was going to lose the building rights, and he made a leap of faith, and we are very happy because it's a very dear project for us. In a beautiful place in Porto, beautiful not in the romantic sense, but in the sense that it's the transition between the industrial suburban housing of Campanhã, a few old factories that are still somehow reminiscent, the train lines, and the yellow line is actually the highway. So it's a building that is not at the end of the city. There's more Porto on that side, but it's at one point that could be the end of a city, in the sense that from that point onwards, the city is completely cut. On one side, it's what we could call the poor side of town, and this is the beginning of good side of town. It's a project that deals with a certain repetition of the same module. So it's a very economical driven project. So we have a series of square meters. Those square meters are to be divided into apartments, and the only criteria from the client was, it's a cake. I want you to do the maximum amount of slices on that cake. Other than that, I don't care, do what you want. And the building rights are given by the fact that there was a factory that existed in that site that had a specific footprint, that had a specific height, so that gives us the maximum width, length, height. But from that point onwards, it's another example of a perimeter. In this case, a perimeter that the factory is demolished, and now we are building the perimeter again, but here's a perimeter that is to be inside that sort of virtual volume. As I said, the cake has to be cut in X amount of slices. Those slices, they need to have always a studio. So let's say these are experimental studios, that's how they call them. One space to live and one space to bath. So the slice, the small part is the bath part, and the front part is the living part. Because of regulations, because of machines, because of accesses, there's a few moments where you have to adjust the form. But what is problematic about this plan, and I think you can see the modern vibe it has because there's a certain repetition, is the fact that the building volume right we had gave us 800 square meters of floor plan. But by law, we could only build 500 square meters in this area. So let's say we have the right to build this much, but we can only do floor for roughly 2/3 of that. So what we proposed to the client was to build the whole volume and to play with section. So sometimes you have 2 levels, sometimes you have just 1 level. But that level is 7 meters high. Sometimes that level is 7 meters high on the sides, but it's very low in the center, and it becomes a cat. Sometimes, so you have 15 times the same apartment, but you have 15 different apartments in the end. And it becomes, again, a parametric project in the sense that the rules are always the same, the opaque wall is this color, blah, 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 blah. But formally speaking, they are all different from each other. And again, like in the previous project, there's this possibility of virtually documenting all of them from the same angle and understanding exactly what each of them is doing. So as I said, it has an history, so it has a volume, an historical volume to preserve, but it starts from laying a first floor, so there's a ground. On that ground, there's this clash between what we could see that is a very regular modern structure and a few things that pop out, a curve, a flying column, a wave, a tilted ceiling. And I would say that the structure photograph is the closest we ever get to a wireframe. And when you look on the opposite direction, you see exactly the same movements moving. And I think the tension between the modernity of the actual structure and the, let's say, surrealism of the gestures is very important to us these days. And it was already in 2016, it seems. And this is the whole system, and this is the photos from the sky. And one of the things that interested a lot to us is the gentle nature of this building, because, as I said, it's a very harsh part of town on this side. It's very violently cut by the train, by the metro, and by the highway. So I thought that the idea that so many people, about 2 million people, cross that area every day, could see a friendly face in the morning could be a nice touch. So the idea that there's a cat in between the bushes looking at the people passing by to us was a driven factor from the start. Even before we had the sections done, we already had this idea. And if you have the cat face, you also have the cat ass on the opposite direction. And the project has this modernity, as I said, from the outside. Some neighbors even assume, and they ask if there's parking garage to rent. So it's sort of that energy that it gives to the outside of the construction site. But when you go in, you can see by the amount of bricks. You have 7 meters of height, a completely empty one in the middle, one with a flying column on the right, one with a stepped ceiling on the left. And the stepped ceiling provides that the one on the top has a specific patio or a specific form also. So it's quite rich. And as we go away from the building, we see the cat. We see the cat from the highway. And we understand that it's really, really, really at what we could call the limit of the city as a city, and as the suburbia starts on the left side. And the last project is actually a collection of 3 that are the same in a way. So we were never very good at winning competitions. We were amazing at losing them. And for a long time, we did not do competitions because we just felt like there was too much work. There was an insane amount of tiny work to do. So we completely disregarded them. But as I said, in the last few years, the economy of the country has changed drastically. So today it's very, very difficult to build at the pace we built before. And it's going to be difficult to build at all very soon, at least on a scale we are. Maybe on the big scale, maybe we're going to become the next Italy and the next Milano. So you either build big promoter stuff or you don't build at all. But out of nowhere, with the European money from the post-COVID fund, the state decided to give a lot of that money to the cities so that the cities could do whatever, rehabilitate infrastructure, build hospitals, build housing. And surprisingly enough, the Institute of Housing was called to organize an insane amount of competitions for housing in a very short time. The only problem is that they always use the same jury. So they assumed that it was okay to have always the same people deciding for different contexts. They would change one person, but 3 of them would always be the same. So it created a way of thinking, a way of designing. And if they were good, it would not be so bad, but they were terrible. So the results of these competitions were not so good, and we lost all of them. So we did like 12, 14 of them. It was a disaster. And at some point, we decided to do what we call the Trojan horses. If we know what they want, we are the stupid ones if we don't give them that. What we have to do is to do it in such a way that we can after transform it, to open the Trojan horse, to deploy it, and to do something else. And we collaborated with Experimental and Pomo from Porto. And by doing this technique that is quite cynical and subversive, we actually won 3 of them. And these 3 projects are now moving towards construction, but they are moving towards construction not as the proposals that won the competition, but actually as the Trojan horses that were deployed. Because what we learned that we did not know at the time is that public commissions are just that. There's no one to control. As long as you respect the budget and the calendar, no one cares. If you have the same amount of apartments you were supposed to, you do whatever. And so we understood this, and over time, from project to project, it became more aggressive how far we went from the competition proposal to what we are building there. And as you can see, they have 3 different project numbers, and they have different colors, but there's already a sense that there's a set of principles that are going to become common to all of them. And this is what I was talking about. So the 32,000 houses that the state wanted to create, and they say they are not abstract, they are houses, they are for people to live in. But in reality, this is how they are judged with that system that it's very abstract. So more important than finding the right project, more important than finding the best possible architecture solution for an architecture problem, is to find a numeric system that protects the jury in case of a future case in court. So the whole system is based on a defensive mechanism for those who judge and not on the projection of a promise for those who will inhabit and live. And if you want to win a competition in Portugal, this is the typical plan you have to do. And you have to do renders like Edge Mateus. That's it. No secret, no joke here. It's exactly that. And we find this text from Jean Nouvel quite rewarding, because it's from 1987, when I was born, exactly the year I was born. And he pretty much is criticizing 1987, saying it's not possible after so many years that we keep doing this. But the apartment he describes is this one. So in 2024 in Portugal, we are doing now what Jean Nouvel in 1987 said, it's way too long, we have to move past this. And that's a problem. The first one is in Setúbal, in a relatively suburban area, quite far from the city center. It is composed of, so I'm already describing the project that is moving forward, not the competition proposal. It's composed out of 2 volumes, one square that somehow solves the rotation and the difference of slope, and 1 bar. The bar is based on a module that has the living room, instead of having 16 square meters and the bedroom 10, both of them have 13. So it creates the possibility that by treating all the spaces, be them the kitchen, the living, the lobby, the hall, let's say, or the bedrooms, with the same size, we hope, we're going to force the users to question how it is to inhabit today an apartment of this nature. Because you have the best view on one side, the best sun on the other, you have the garden on one side, but the park on the other. So it's interesting to imagine how will this operate once, maybe they are going to all put the bedrooms on one side and the living room on the other. It's perfectly possible and highly probable, but it's not our role to do that. It's our role to propose and to accept that something else might happen. If only one of them does the opposite, we won. And there's this nature where, regardless of the room where you are, wherever you look, you never really know. You don't have a clear anchor point that says this is obviously a room for day activities and this is obviously a room for night activities. And from a compositional perspective, the bar is ended with 2 black surfaces. The tower, that is not a tower because it's very short, it's ended with a black hat. The 3rd project, so this is not the second, it's the 3rd. It's a sort of neoplastic wet dream of ours, because it has from a typological perspective, it's a gallery access, first of all. It continues with, so it has, in Portugal does not have a strong tradition in the last few years of galleries, so this is one of the 2 competitions out of 50-something that had gallery accesses. And the apartment goes through. So what it does is that by putting the kitchen in a less obvious position of the center, it liberates 2 symmetrical and in relation with the outside spaces, and somehow dilutes the circulation to a sort of in-between condition, and makes the module of the stair become the module of the bedroom. So you can see the plan is sort of self-explanatory, but it gives you this sense of continuity. So I don't know if everyone is going to put the table on the top and the sofa on this side. I don't know if everyone is going to use the bedrooms as bedrooms, but it's interesting to us to imagine that it's undefined enough, just a little bit, because it fulfills the, let's say, the needs of a traditional family, but it's undefined enough to maybe offer, again, a different possibility of how these apartments can be inhabited. When you see the group of the 2 buildings, you can understand the rule of these lines and how these doors, when they are open, they allow the whole apartment to go through. Also the 2 exceptions, the elevators, one on each block. And this is it. So when you are inside, you are always somehow seeing everything at the same time. So you see the dining space, that can be the living space. You see inside the bedroom. You see that that's sort of private, but not too much. So it's an experiment of sorts. And why did I call it a neoplastic experiment? Because the whole facade is structured vertically. So in Portugal, to win a competition, you have to have the demarcation of the slabs. The fault is from Promontório, a big office from Lisbon that created the state-of-the-art long time ago. And we lost, as I said, we lost 12 competitions, 12, 14, it doesn't matter, a lot of them, by doing vertical tension facades. It's not okay. So in this one, the greatest change is that it's actually a vertical tension facade. And what we tried to do, even to emphasize that, was to move the structural columns to the outside, giving even more tension. And on the gallery side, which by default has to be horizontal, the columns pop out so that it still can compensate the horizontality. And then the squares, they sort of structure it and give it more strength on the vertical tension. And the last one, that is actually the second one, is by far the biggest. It's 25,000 square meters, 150 apartments, 25 million euros of construction. So it's all numbers that we say them because it makes us feel adults, but we don't really understand what this means. It's a scale that is, one of these blocks alone is 5 times the size of everything we ever built put together. So this is the scale. And the competition was won, in this case, with a very intelligent section, because instead of digging to do the parking, we proposed to somehow use this space on this side, and by doing that, solve a topographical issue and save money. So to win the competition, you also have to be strategical in that sense. And by doing that, what we do is that we have 5 levels of housing on the top, and then the common programs on the ground floor and the garage between the 2. In terms of construction, I show this section just as an example. The same section, the same slab construction, the same detail for the shading, the same detail for the handrail, does the 3 competitions. That's not important. I mean, actually, it is important in the sense that it's exactly the same. So it becomes important because it is repeated. And then you see that from a constructive point, it has 2.48 ceiling height, so it's very low. But at the same time, it has the doors going floor to ceiling. That gives it a certain mobility. It has a lot of glass on both sides. And this is how the plan is composed. It's based on a series of metrics, on a series of rules. And the typical apartment defines the rule. And on the 2 ends, there's an exception with 3-bedroom apartments. So 2-bedroom apartments in the middle, 2 exceptions on each end. And here you see how the plan operates. You have an over-dimensioned lobby that almost fulfills the same size as the living space. There's a relatively generous but only usable as kitchen space on this side, which forces you to wonder what is going to happen here. And then from the living space and from the bedroom space, you always have the possibility of cross view. So whatever you want in the house, if the doors are open, you can see light in the morning on one side and in the evening in the other. The fact that our regulation still forces 2 elevators, a lobby with a certain dimension, all the generosity of the plan is lost in regulations here, but there's nothing we can do about it. But this is what we call a Swiss typology with Portuguese areas, because we are used to see this sort of typologies with Peter Merkley, Amy, Lucians, but they have 120, 140 square meters. These are apartments that sometimes brutto 75. That's the maximum they can go. So it's very, very compact. It's the same idea, but we hope, because it's so smaller, more intense to be understood. So this is what happens on the end. So it's exactly the same typology, but it grows an annex on that side that becomes a traditional apartment. So you have a traditional bedroom area plus a working area, or a normal bedroom. And on the opposite side, we introduce this possibility that you have a unit inside this apartment that can be rented separately for, a rental, sublet, something of that nature. So it's the same apartment on both ends, but not exactly the same. And what it does is this: so wherever you are in the house, you always have this perception that there's a view, there's a continuity to the outside, and when you go on the opposite direction, you have this. Because this is in a very high part of town, so you have a very open view on the main facade. So the windows are cheap. Again, they are yellow. It's something we learned from the cheapest project we did so far. But it's important to us that this facade has the generosity of contributing not with height, because we can't, not with width, we don't have the space, but with openness, with projection to the exterior. So the two perspectives, so from the kitchen to the living, from living to the kitchen, and finally the facade. And in this case, it was very interesting to us, the idea of replicating 3 times the same building. Imagine Ville-Savoie, Ville-Savoie, Ville-Savoie. Imagine building 3 times the same building next to each other. And that happens, of course, because of costs, because of economy of quantity, but also as this possibility of a Xerox building. So, a building that, you could take it from Almada, you can put it in, I don't know, Kansas, and it still works. The materiality of the facade deals, I asked to put the 3 screens because of this slide, finally, to imagine the 3 of them in a big slide together. The materiality of the facade has simultaneously the cheapness of that project I showed before, but also the industrial nature of working with gradil for the handrails, the Sotz's energy of the stripes, of the yellow, of the strong green and blue. At the same time, a kind of Lacaton Vassal-esque attitude of, you don't design, you just repeat, you accept it. But it's all of that and is none of that at the same time. So it's a sort of big dimension exercise that we are treating as if we were doing a house. So what we try to do in normal houses, we try to do here, but with themes that are 50 times bigger than before. And the facade has this nature of a screen, because every single wall on this direction is opaque, every single centimeter of the facade on this direction is glazed with yellow frames. And so this is the virtual construction I was talking about before. We are very excited about this moving towards construction, but at the same time desperate that it might be a disaster, because it's a whole scale and a kind of client that is completely alien to the reality we are used to. So, well, let's see. And to finish, I started by showing these 2 sentences, and as I explained before, we want to do what is on the top, but unfortunately, it is more and more obvious to us that it's not possible, because the context in which we operate, and now with gentrification even more, doesn't want it. So what we understood recently, when we moved from gloriously repeating to the definition of an archipelago, is that we just have to invert the problem. It's not a problem, it's actually an advantage that plays in our side. The fact that no one cares should liberate us to do cultural, social work to a certain extent, and to engage with society in a way that if they would care, they would not allow us to do. Thank you so much.
Bueno, mientras todos nos tomamos un respiro después de toda esta cantidad de trabajo inmenso, ¿hay alguien que tenga alguna pregunta que hacer? Lucía. Bueno, o si no, pasamos al público. ¿Alguna pregunta? Podéis preguntar en castellano,
sí,
porque te entiende. Él contestará en inglés o en portuñol.
Hello, Filipe. Thank you for being here with us. And I just want to ask you one question that I am interested to know, and it's about the color and how important is the color in your project, and which materials you work in your projects, because I see that in the exterior of your projects, I mean in the facade, you use some materials for represent some, how to say it, texture, I mean. But inside the buildings, I see an absence of materiality. So if you can explain this, how important is colors of your projects in your drawings, of course, and yeah, that's.
Thank you for the question. I think that color is a material, and in a text, I think it's in the same text, we say that color is a sufficient material. Of course, we as architects, at least in our case, we don't fetishize to save the world. We participate on the process, but it's not our main drive. But we fetishize that a surface detaches from another surface, that a specific element is exuberant enough to be understood on its own and not in relation with others. And sometimes you do that with the material, with stone, with metal, with mirror. Sometimes you do that with color. And the fact is that color is fast, is cheap, anyone can apply it. And if you make it a bit more red, it has a specific effect. If you make it a bit more blue, it has another effect. So I would say color is not very different from stone in that sense. And sometimes we have the budget to use stone, but we still prefer color. So it's not just economies. It's just not because it's cheaper. But it's always a go-to plan, because you know that you can always go back to color and to do something wonderful without, sacrificing too much. And yeah, and we come in Portugal. We have a huge tradition of colorful architecture. If you go to Porto, for example, you would see tiles. You would see also stone. You will see a lot on the streets. But the common sense of today's mainstream response is white, beige, light gray. It's somehow sad. And if you go, for example, to the riverfront over the years, because of the heritage department rules, every time a building is renovated, for some reason I cannot understand, the window frames, they imitate the old wood, but they are white. So when you go to Guy and you look back, for some reason, all the window frames are white. And the colors of the tiles are protected, but not the colors of the window frames, which is strange. So I think that we don't want to go for that kind of flattening of the use of color. But we also don't want to just put color because we put color. We always try to give it an intent, normally about detachment, about separation, about collision, and that's it. Color is a good material.
And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Any other question? ¿Más preguntas?
Hi, thanks for the talk. I would like to ask you a personal question. How do you feel about Robert Venturi? Because you mentioned a lot of Japanese references, but I was always thinking about Robert.
Robert Venturi, John Rauch, and Denise Scott Brown were probably as important to us as Shinohara. Today I went more Japanese, but I could do a presentation one of these days, and it is as much about them as it is about Shinohara today. It's quintessential.
So for you it's like a compliment to be compared to Robert Venturi.
I mean, I did not understand that as a comparison, but yes, it would be, yes.
Thanks.
¿Alguien más? Bueno, primero de todo, muchísimas gracias por venir. Ha sido un placer. La verdad es que es increíble la cantidad de trabajo que hacen y tan bueno. Y un par de avisos que haceros antes de subir a tomar una cerveza. Sabéis que los libros estos tan raros que explicaba al principio están en la biblioteca. O sea, son unos libros raros y buenos y los tenemos en la biblioteca. El de las casas japonesas y el nuevo que ha sacado como de colectivo portugueses, o sea que lo tenéis. También avisaros que van a participar en el siguiente Quadans que dirigen Stigman, Escolano y Mariné con unos dibujos, o sea que van a estar presentes en el Quadans. Y ya por último, explicaros que a todos los que seáis estudiantes hay una información que podéis recoger y que se os regalará un Quadans de Europa Europa primera etapa, que se hizo hace tiempo y está ahí para que lo cojáis gratis. Antes de subir, por supuesto, a tomar la cerveza arriba y pues que lo colocáis directamente o habléis con él más en privado o como queráis. Así que, bueno, muchas gracias por venir. Y lo último, perdón, habrá un descanso de una semana, en la siguiente será dentro de 15 días que vendrá Baukunst desde Bruselas.